everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jam Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we are coming at you with two big news for two new releases. We're going to be talking today about the newest album from dance pop diva Jessie Ware, and we're also going to be talking about, of course, the new album from indie rock stalwarts, The National, which we have an entire discography retrospective on that we did last year, completed at the very beginning of this year. If you want to know our thoughts on all of their albums, boy, we have the playlist for you. Go check those out, get caught up, and then come right back here to talk about where the narrative takes us.
Absolutely. Yeah, really proud of that series, incidentally. It took us a while to finish, but it's like when you can pull something like that off, when you have like full, almost feature-length analyses of every album, a whole discography, it's like those are really, really cool to pull off. And so
I did it.
So we are, of course, very excited to get into the new National album, and we're going to be doing that a bit later on. But first, we're going to talk about this new Jessie Ware album. Now, it's something that is we are hyper aware of, the three of us, because we're making this show. This is our channel, but most of our viewers probably don't remember or maybe even care about the fact that our last review of Jessie Ware for her 2020 album, What's Your Pleasure, one of the most critically acclaimed albums of 2020, one of my favorite albums of that year, an album that Morgan loved as well, which was a review that was the source of some tension.
If you asked me to get up and dance to this, I wouldn't want to. So that kind of leaves me at an impasse, even though I do have more specific complaints here, mainly with the production. Microcosm here being the tinny synths on Soul Control are annoying as hell, and the album has fucking moments like this everywhere. Let me finish.
This motherfucker said tinny synths on this album.
This album sounds cheap and plasticky and gimmicky as fuck. Every time I listened to it, I was just like, wow, am I supposed to be impressed here? Because I'm not.
So it was divisive, to say the least. And it ended up being one of the more memorable moments for us of that first initial year of recording the podcast. And especially for me as well, as that album continued to grow in favorability, one of my favorite dance records of the last several years, Jessie fully ascending to pop stardom as well. But finally, we're here with the follow-up to that record, a heavily anticipated album with a number of huge lead singles that were released well in advance of the record. And of course, with what I think is a strong contender for album title of the year, That Feels Good.
Feels good.
2 exclamation marks. Always a fan of unusual uses of punctuation in album titles. So we're finally here to review this heavily anticipated new album, which has lit the internet on fire. Basically, everyone I know is head over heels for this album, and with good reason as well. I mean, it is Jessie doing what Jessie does best. She has this element of kitsch and camp to her particular brand of pop and house music, which obviously is par for the course with the history of the genre as well. It's a genre with deeply rooted sort of queer antecedents, and it is a genre and a style of music as well that is incredibly popular with the gays. It's no surprise that this has been received fairly rapturously, given how heavily Jessie's leaning into that with this album. Some of those kitschier elements, some of those campier elements are really turned up to 11, and the album being considerably shorter than What's Your Pleasure as well, considerably more to the point, considerably more in your face in a lot of respects, makes it feel like it has this sense of urgency that What's Your Pleasure had only in moments. I would say it was a bit more of a measured album with some really stratospheric highs, but also some great slow burns as well. This isn't really an album that does slow burns. There's 1 or 2 tracks that are kind of in that vein, but for the most part, this is really in your face.
I think this is quite a different album from What's Your Pleasure in a handful of ways, and yet my feelings on it are almost exactly the same. I feel like What's Your Pleasure is maybe a little too lengthy and doesn't quite maintain that momentum It's hard to describe the balance between the two because they feel like two different takes on kind of the same dancey emotion.
It's like White Suit Pleasure is supposed to kind of convey, to me anyway, like a full night out, at the club, the hazy glow of whatever happens next, the after party, all that kind of stuff. You end in a daze with those last two songs on that record, which are really kind of slower pace, but beautiful in a way that not the whole record really is. Whereas that feels good. I mean, you got that title right there, right? It's so in your face. It's so effusive about it. And the whole album really, to me, is about just leaning into that particular thing. I mean, towards the end, I think it trails off a little bit and slows down kind of into a slightly different mode of itself. But for the most part, this thing is just so unapologetic about what it is. And in a lot of ways, it feels like to its benefit and sometimes to its detriment, it can be so Jessie Ware and so campy and so kitschy that you really have to get on board with the cheese of it all. I think you really have to be able to embrace that and kind of connect to that to fully enjoy the experience. I think it's kind of tasteless in certain respects, but it really delivers some hard fucking hooks. Free Yourself, which was the first single released, still one of my favorites on the album, just absolutely immense track. Pearls, which is I think the standout on the record if I were to highlight just one song, really lands for me as well. There is also other moments on the record like Shake the Bottle and Hello Love, and even the opening title track as well, which really kind of get a little bit gauche with that campiness. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's something that had a cuteness to it when it was appeared in moments on What's Your Pleasure, like the little kisses and that, and Save a Kiss, and just little tiny details on that album that I really liked as bits of personality. Whereas the personality can kind of come full center stage and even override some of the songs to a small extent on this record, I think. That's a quibble because I'm still enjoying this album a great deal. I still think it really goes, but I will digress at this point because all eyes are pointed to Jake to deliver a verdict on Jessie Ware's. And I know that you're probably painfully aware that you have a history with this artist and you're coming at this trying to deliver a fresh take with the context of not getting on very well with that last album. And regardless of our podcast, it's always awkward when an album is like regarded as one of the albums of the year and you're just not there with it at all. So it creates a tension in your relationship with an artist. So Jake, I want to know, coming at this as a Jessie Ware skeptic, what were your initial thoughts and what do you make of that? Feels good.
As I'll probably go into a bit more with our Now episode this week, after I first initially listened to this album, I was like, I need to immerse myself in music like this because I guess I was certainly ill-equipped just because that was a lot earlier in the podcast, and I felt like a lot of my takes came across as a bit two-dimensional. To quote Ryley, I displayed a fundamental lack of understanding when it came to dance music.
That's what I said.
So, and it didn't help that I was
That's
also
such an asshole thing to say.
It didn't help that I was also easily, like, while I didn't love the album, I was easily the hottest on the newer Kylie Minogue album that year, and nobody else was. And I feel like that really kind of hit the nail in the coffin for just being like, well, I guess I just have shit taste when it comes to this. And so I really wanted to listen to dance music and house music and, stuff that Jessie was drawing from and does also draw from here in an attempt to further make myself literate to inform my take a little bit more, so I didn't come across as two-dimensional in what I have to say here. So I did that, and I came to a bit of a discovery. And I have to thank also fellow music YouTube reviewer presence, Spectrum Pulse, for his illuminating thoughts on both Jessie Ware records, in that he liked What's Your Pleasure, but was distinctly colder on it than other critics. And that was sort of the angle of his review, where he talked about why exactly that was. And I made a discovery in that we have often referred to me having a bit of a house music allergy. And the thing is that if you go back and look at all of the stuff that we reviewed in this podcast, when we review like record clubs, new releases, whatever, and it has to do with like house or house music influences or whatever, I like all of them. Like, I make a point to mention, it's just like, despite my house music allergy, I found this to be pretty damn good. And I was like, I sure have said that a lot. Maybe I don't actually have a house music allergy. And after a couple of key listens I've had this week, I've discovered, I guess I really don't. So then, what
Ryley
was it
fucking
about What's Your
gassed.
Pleasure?
So Ryley fucking gaslit you into thinking you have a house allergy.
I mean, that was partially self-inflicted. That's partially on me as well. I introduced myself to house music with like deep house shit back when I didn't even listen to like ambient music. So that's partially on me. But I needed to discover what the sort of thing was that, like, if that wasn't it with What's Your Pleasure, then what was? Because that was still taking from a lot of things that I like. I like pop music. I like dance pop. And hell, I'm still, I enjoy a disco flavoring now and again. And the thing is that I finally discovered what it was. I like disco. I don't like 80s disco. And I feel like What's Your Pleasure, in an attempt to amalgamate all of the sounds from the scenes that Jessie was drawing from, kind of lent into a lot of 80s disco influences that have distinctly stiffer grooves that comes across as cooler, more confident, more effortless on something like What's Your Pleasure. And that's just not for me, frankly. Like, I just don't get along with that kind of sound. So, again, when approaching the new Jessie Ware album, I was like, all right, so what's going to be the deal here? And I saw that it was being received well. That didn't surprise me. And this is one of my favorite albums of the year.
I had a feeling this was coming.
Oh yeah, Grandma.
This album is a tight 40 minutes, non-stop rush of dance, soul, disco, euphoria. And I adore it in all of its camp glory. Like the Beyonce album last year, in fact, I love how expressive Jessie Ware as a performer is on this album. Unapologetically, she'll go into bits of spoken word on stuff like Shake the Bottle, for instance, which is a glorious camp track where it's like the very beginning of this, it immediately starts off with this little guitar riff, and like, I don't mind that she did this, but this is literally the same instrumental hook as The Weeknd's Sacrifice from Dawn FM last year. Listen to it. It's the same. It's the same guitar thing. And it works here and it works there, and I don't mind. But she immediately goes into like this lyrical series of storytelling innuendo laden. It's like a gender swapped Mambo number 5, and she just tears through all of these men and like the little details about their lives, and it's amazing. It puts a smile on my face every fucking time. And then she doesn't abandon like her traditional strengths on parts like this where she leans into like the weirder, campier tendencies, because like the things like the melodies on the chorus hook on this are amazing. All of the parts of this that are supposed to be catchy are positively insatiable. There's an immaculate sort of push and pull between the energies of each section of songs like this one, and it just feels like a microcosm for kind of the flow of the album, which I think is fucking terrific for what the album's going for. As Ryley said, it's kind of electing to channel a kind of very in the moment musical euphoria, whereas like again things like the last Jessie Ware album and Beyonce, for instance, those use their longer length to evoke how tired you are at the end of the night when you're dancing, and that can have its various levels of how well it works for you. But on here, the tighter concision just allows me to engage and have more fun with this. I mean, the first couple songs on this, the opening run here, is simply fucking immaculate. Like, holy shit, how does anybody craft dance music this consistently amazing? That Feels Good is awesome. You have that start of the little bits of like ASMR that are, again, super campy. That feels good. And every part of this song, again, feels like its own hook. The backing vocals, which are basically the star of this album other than Jessie. Every time gang vocals or like almost a choral refrain will come in, it is electrifying. I love it. The verse lines, the bass line, the part where the little pleasure is a right is fucking awesome. I love that shit. It's gorgeous. Loads of fun. And like that guitar synth sax breakdown at the end of the intro. Oh, it's sexy. And then immediately go into a song that starts with this killer fucking drum beat and these high register vocals from Jessie, who I just think is sensational across this entire album. Like, she's warmer, she's more colorful, she's more coy and playful. She's always suggesting sexuality, but never directly really involving herself in it, only through aggressive, humorous innuendo. And I like that. It displays a different kind of control that she displayed from that last record, for instance. And, you know, her performances on that album, they were more controlled, they were more precise, they were more skillful, but they also came across as a bit colder to me, and that's simply gone here. The free yourself hook has been in my head all week. It's so good. And then the horn lines and the piano on the bridge at the end of this, it's an anthem. Candy. And then you go immediately after that with a third track, which goes for the throat. It like instantly she comes onto this song and she sounds exactly like Donna Summers. Stunning fucking vocal performance. And maybe the album's best hook, the Shake It Till the Pearls Fall Off, is just like everything that's great about this album is in this hook, and I fucking love that shit. Just the notion of like wearing pearls on the dance floor and just fucking partying so fucking hard that the necklace breaks. You don't give a fuck. And then those strings that really, really carefully, the transition into the gang vocals on the bridge near the end here, just go to show how laden with detail every part of the song construction on this album is. And then we get Hello Love after that, which kind of slows things down from the relentless momentum of the first couple of tracks, and it's more soulful. There's just, it's unbelievably sexy sounding, and I adore it. It invokes lyrical themes of just how warm and comfortable you are around a partner, and just to break up the sort of interstitial flow of the album. I think this is a flawless way to do it. And I mean, again, those fucking horns, man, holy shit. And from here on out, I think that, yeah, maybe the album doesn't reach the Titanic heights of that immaculate 4-track run from here on out, but it is far from over with highlights. I mean, I love the slinky bass and percussion that starts off Beautiful People. There are parts of this song that invoke things like Uptown Funk, or even some of the stuff that was on the Anderson .Paak and Bruno Mars collab project. I noticed a lot of sonic similarities between those two things. This is like loungy, but still really energetic. Freak Me, it's like, this is like the most properly house-driven thing, and it's pure escapism in the name of pursuing pleasure, and it's just so much fun.
Dude, the hook on this song, best fucking just, it's all week I've got, baby, warm me up, baby, don't just go cool me down. Like, all week I've been doing that.
Yes, that is 100, and I think it comes at a perfect point in the album too, where you need something that is really energetic and upbeat, but something that still kind of cools you down from before, because before that song you get the immaculate, the incomparable, the absolutely perfect Begin Again. The tension is immediate. It's uplifting, it's jazzy, it's huge. There's a dueling piano and sax between the chorus and second verse that get my fucking blood pumping, and those string swells on the second verse and everywhere else on this album just tickle that part of my brain that dispenses dopamine in all of the best ways. This is the entire album in one song. It's about reveling in the moment of the highest apex of dance euphoria. It is the most exciting thing here for my money. And again, Freak Me Now, fun as fuck. Shake the Bottle, hilarious. Enjoy the shit out of it. And The album ends insanely strongly with Lightning and These Lips. Lightning feels like the most intimate moment on the album. There are parts of this that sound Sade adjacent in the hooks, the connection between her and the person that she values most. For lack of a better term, this song is kind of wholesome, honestly. It's a top tier bedroom jam. And then These Lips just ends it all with a bang. Jessie said she takes the connection she's demonstrated with her partner in those moments of intimacy over the course of the record, and then she blows it up to the dance-sized explosion of everything else. And it's this tense slow burn just so she can make it IMAX scale several different times throughout the chorus of this song. And she's fusing everything together here with this beautiful linear dance groove, and it displays a legitimately tangible connection forged by love and unfurls into a song that could easily be twice its length, and I would have no complaints with whatsoever. This is amazing. I love this.
I'm so thrilled, to be honest. I've never been more glad to be wrong. Because I was like, earlier in the week, I was just like, oh, I think that the eccentricities of this being dialed up so much are probably only going to make you more, probably going to only rub you more the wrong way. But I'm so glad to have been wrong by that. And your walkthrough of your explorations of different forms of dance music as well is quite informative too, because you're right. What's Your Pleasure has a lot of influences specifically from the late 70s and through the 80s as well, a lot of synth pop influences, whereas with this record it does feel like she's casting the net further back. Like there's of course elements of soul and funk all through What's Your Pleasure as well, especially the funk side of things, but it feels like she's really casting a wider net into that soul realm, into that kind of like ballroom historical kind of, there's just this sort of classical feel to a lot of these songs. It's kind of hard to describe it in the right terms because that's not an aesthetic. It's just a vibe. It's an atmosphere. You get the it evokes ballrooms and it evokes massive sort of palatial, dance arenas from like the 30s and 40s, but it infuses them with aesthetics from the 60s and the 70s, and then of course a personality that's so modern and so completely fully realized within 21st century context. There's like all these different elements that are infused through what Jessie does, and it's really impressive and really charismatic. And I think for me, my inability to fully get on board with this to the same extent as What's Your Pleasure. And look, let me again contextualize that by saying I love this record. I think it's a great album. I'm just talking comparatively because that record to me was like such a high watermark. It was something I connected with so immediately and dominated my world so completely. It's always going to be difficult to compare anything else that Jessie does or to consume anything else that Jessie does with that context overhanging it. But what is the greatest success of That Feels Good is how completely untethered from any concerns this album is. There's not even really any kind of self-consciousness in terms of Jessie crafting or evolving her personality at all. If anything, she's making herself more two-dimensional on this album than she did on that record, but doing so purposefully with the aim of giving you this full uninhibited sugar rush just hit of intensity that is honestly a really wise way to follow up such a sweeping and grand and emotionally complex dance record, is just to completely become a little bit, go more insular and invoke one particular mode and really explore that through and through. And the songs just bang. I mean, this is the thing that is most rewarding about That Feels Good. I mean, you can tell that it was made with a high budget as well. You can tell a lot of studio money went into this album, and it's not just because it sounds good, but it's because these mixes are filled out. Like there's always like about 3 or 4 or 5 different things happening at once in the layering in these songs, that if a hook isn't landing as well as you want it to, or if one particular thing isn't animating you as fully as you would like, there's 3 or 4 other things to appreciate and admire in their craft also happening throughout the song as well. Like Beautiful People, the vocal performance is probably the least interesting part of that song to me, but I love it because there's so much happening underneath all of that, and it feels like this real party where you have this synthesis of different instrumentation and different layering that works as a kind of analog to this idea of being in a crowded environment with people all kind of moving on their own wavelength, but at the same time all united in the same goal. It's just effervescently catchy and addictive, Freak Me Now, like I said, I am stuck on this song so much because the hook is so addictive to me. You're right about Begin Again as well. It has this, like, it's like the album sort of with Hello Love, it kind of purposefully allows itself to bring the momentum down. And I don't know if I agree with that decision, just because it has such a fire with those first three songs that it feels like peering it back that quickly almost takes me out of it a little bit. But then it's like you appreciate that what that is doing is setting up Begin Again, which is this song that is kind of, you're starting in a sort of slower, lower place and sort of building you up, you know, representing a kind of rebirth or rediscovery. And it works in that context. It delivers something that makes sense retrospectively. So yeah, I am completely taken with this. I love the vast majority of it. I do think that the last three tracks are not my favorite, and they do kind of leave the record a little bit in a bit of a lull for me. Like with Shake the Bottle, there's elements of that sort of cutesy storytelling that just kind of don't really land for me. I'm kind of bit more of an eye roll than a giggle. But it's a song that has such an infectious bass line and central core elements that it's hard to be mad at it. There's a lot of great stuff happening there as well. I think that the record suffers a little bit for me just because of what a high watermark its predecessor is, and because its singular, more focused and narrow aspirations make it kind of especially weak by comparison. But at the end of the day, it's a really fun, really peppy, really addictive, and really catchy dance record, and you can't project too many aspirations onto it beyond that. I definitely am also, I guess, I've also spent a lot of time this week listening to a record that feels as though it's a very clear predecessor for this, which is Roisin Murphy's Overpowered. And Roisin Murphy and Kylie Minogue both feature on the opening track here as well as backing vocalists. Mm-hmm. And I definitely think that I have been getting such a feeding from that particular record and some of the other dance records I've been into recently that I was kind of overloaded when I initially approached this, but I have come to appreciate it more and more. Free Yourself, Pearls, Begin Again, and Freak Me Now are just such irresistible, huge, larger than life songs that they are easily some of the best that Jessie's ever made. And I completely see why people are fully head over heels in love with this. It is so hard to resist. It's so ecstatic and euphoric about its own identity and who it is and what it wants to do that it's a balm, basically, for a bad mood.
I mean, it's just so tightly designed. I think that, honestly, what separates What's Your Pleasure and this, to me, I think that you're right. I think that What's Your Pleasure is an attempt to cover more bases and create a more holistic record, which is this is way more focused in its attempt, but in its construction, in its flow, I feel more of an active attempt for a push and pull of energy when listening to this album. Whereas What's Your Pleasure, in being holistic and, trying to just sort of deplete you and being that night-long just sort of extravaganza, it felt like those multifaceted songs were in service of an effect on me, the listener, the dancer, whatever, that felt a little bit monotonous. Whereas here, I feel a little bit more involved in the album's actual pacing and construction. And it's really just that Jessie doesn't necessarily make herself completely more two-dimensional. I just think she trades one kind of depth for another. And I feel like that's what makes her exciting as an artist right now, is that we don't really have anyone doing what she's doing as confident as she's doing it. And this album and the last one just prove her versatility. She can do, these albums prove, regardless of how you feel about either, that she basically can do anything right now in the world of dance pop. And that's fucking awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, more straightforward level, the album cover is a total serve. Everything about what Jessie's doing here performance-wise is a total serve. The attitude, everything. It's so cheeky, but in a way that she's so earned the ability to be and can so pull off. I love that. I mean, look, and even I say that even though not every moment of cheekiness works for me, but I acknowledge that the serve is greater than my perspective could ever be. And also want to appreciate the fact that the album title almost kind of doesn't work perfectly, but it almost sort of works as an answer to the question of the last album. You know, what's your pleasure? That
Yeah,
feels good.
that's the albums. That's what's your pleasure is a question with many answers, and that feels good is just a pointed answer. It's perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like right there encapsulated in those titles is everything we've been saying. So bravo. Take a bow, Miss Ware.
She was cooking.
All right, shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings then for Jessie Ware's That Feels Good?
Feels good.
Bustin' makes me feel good.
3 favorite tracks. Begin Again, one of the best songs of the year, hands down. Pearls, one of the best hooks of the year, and the rest of the song is just as good. And I'm gonna say These Lips. I think it's a terrific closer to the record. 9 out of 10. Top 10 of the year so far, and this will be hard to beat, frankly.
Damn. He said the big number. Morgan, your turn.
Yeah, 3 favorites. I don't know, it's really hard between Begin Again and Free Yourself, but I don't know, I think the vocal hook on Free Yourself might be I might like it a little more. So I'll go with that, and then Begin Again and Pearls. You're working up that mountain. I can't get that high. I just can't. It's not possible. Yeah, I'll give it an 8.
My 2 favorites, I mean, it's just the 2 twin pinnacles of this are Free Yourself and Pearls, and I'll put Freak Me Now in a very admirable 3rd place. Least favorite for me is also Lightning, and I'm going to give the album a 7.5, which gives us an average overall of 8.2 for Jessie Ware's That Feels Good. All right, without further ado, let's move on to a big, heavily, hotly anticipated album, The National's new record, their 9th studio LP, First 2 Pages of Frankenstein. This is a record that's come obviously with a lot of anticipation, especially for us as huge National fans. We did a whole series on their discography, as we talked about at the start of this video. And also, you know, as is the case with the last several National rollouts as well, live performances of many of these songs preceded the announcement or the recorded versions. And there was a sense from those live recordings as well that the National were heading into this more animated space, this more energetic, this more vibrant, this more fiery place than they had been on I'm Easy to Find. And for anyone who doesn't know, because I'm Easy to Find is a record that gets, you know, a pretty muted reception, generally speaking. We were all huge fans of that album. I mean, our I Am Easy to Find video is one of the best videos in the whole retrospective, I think. I mean, really just taking that album apart, the incredible concept behind it, the great multimedia accompaniment, the real emotional heft of that record, as unwieldy as it is, something that really appeals to all of us. But it's definitely part of a trend with the National that they've been heading in a lot of ways. You know, when they perform live, they deliver these incandescent, fiery, larger than life versions of their songs that often end up in a slightly more muted form on the album itself. And that tends to be an adaptation that Aaron Dessner, who obviously produces these records, makes to suit the format of the studio album as well, to create a particular atmosphere that, I guess in their view, anything too violently or jaggedly produced would kind of cut through that and kind of upset that balance. So that's a kind of mode that they've settled into. And so it wasn't too surprising that when the singles for this album started releasing, they certainly weren't as incandescent and as vibrant and as full of life as the live versions were by comparison anyway. And they were songs that felt as though they carried with them a kind of exhaustion that is not new from that, but certainly feels more pointed than ever before. And this is where some pretty important backstory, I guess, into the album's creation is worth elaborating on. This is an album, and it's funny because this is the kind of story that's told about almost every National album. So it doesn't really feel novel, but it was an album that was very difficult for the band to make. It was an album that very nearly ended in the band breaking up entirely. It was an album that was completely defined in its recording process by Matt Berninger's crippling writer's block. I mean, he could not write a page. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't find inspiration, he was completely in a stuck place. Again, not a new experience for Matt when writing a record, but one that felt, in his words, to really be different this time, to be particularly difficult to get above. And they were searching for inspiration, and they were searching for something to animate them. Well, actually, Matt was. The band themselves were doing great, but Matt was searching for something to animate himself throughout this entire process. And something that ultimately led to the door opening was one day when he decided to pick up a copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, open the book to its first 2 pages, which in a great video by Professor Sky, which I highly recommend. He spends about 20 minutes analyzing the title of this album and using a copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to illustrate how difficult it is to interpret. He does it way better than I can make it sound, so I'm not going to reiterate his points. But so the story is he opened up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to the first 2 pages, picked 2 words, which were the words tranquilize and ocean, and kind of just created a scene from those 2 words, and ultimately ended up writing a song, which is the song Your Mind Is Not Your Friend with Phoebe Bridgers, which is on the album. And that kind of kicked the door open to the writing process for the whole album. And so what this ends up being is it's an album that is very explicitly about being in a rut, more so than any other National album before, I would say. It's an album that's very explicitly about being in a place where you are stuck and you can't move forward. There's some songs that allude to a breakup, like Eucalyptus, for instance, this idea of being in a situation where everything's kind of fallen apart and you have no idea how to move forward, and you're kind of stuck and stubborn and refusing to do what's necessary, kind of shifting that load onto someone else. And then there's other songs as well, like This Isn't Helping, where the prevailing atmosphere and vibe and mood and feeling is just that I am completely broken and I have no way of progressing, and nothing that anyone does around me is helping me in any way. So it's a very difficult record that has this hanging atmosphere of tension and brokenness all throughout it. It's in a lot of ways really unpleasant to listen to, in a way that previous National records haven't been, or have been in certain moments, but not to this extent. I mean, when I listen to this, I really feel this overwhelming fatigue that Matt is clearly experiencing when trying to kind of strike the well of creativity on this thing. I don't want to project too much into how much he was suffering or whatever while writing this, but to me, this does sound like an album made by someone who is very depressed. And that's something that I say, knowing that Matt, only because Matt has talked about the fact he was actually really depressed while making this as well. And it's the all of these songs, to me, almost all of them anyway, there's a couple of exceptions, the prevailing feeling is just like, I'm really depressed and I can't see a way out of this. It is a blank wall in front of me. And the songs reflect that in ways that are interesting on that level, but also ultimately feel dissatisfying and anticlimactic and frustrating in a way that obviously is a product of being in that mind space. It's in a weird, twisted sense, it's like the perfect realization of depression and writer's block, because it feels like those things feel, which is cold, unsatisfying, lifeless, colorless, a lot of really unpleasant things. And it captures those, but it also just feels really dissatisfying as a listening experience, because it doesn't achieve a pathos out of that like previous National records are. With every National album, there's a sense of catharsis in embracing your fuck-ups, your failure, your stuckness. Whereas here it's like just banging into a brick wall and blindly fumbling around. That's my intro presage to my thoughts on this. It's not a record that's been received very well by a lot of National fans. There's a lot of general disappointment. And while I can completely understand that, and I honestly am a part of that to a certain extent, as a National fan, I want to get it. I want to be able to appreciate it on the level that it was clearly created with. But for me, listening to this album is empty. And I don't get anything greater or more satisfying or more cathartic out of the fugue of it than as I do with national records that can be similarly dreary and grey, like Trouble Will Find Me. So yeah, I'm in a weird place with this one. What do you guys think?
Look, I've been dreading this all week just because, I mean, to forecast my opinion, I very much find myself in line with the consensus and with Ryley to an extent. But the thing is that every national album is a grower to some extent. I felt that way about all of their albums, and even the ones I love the most, especially the ones I love the most. Sleep Well Beast was an album I had to go on a 3-year-long journey with to get where I am with it. And even something like Trouble Will Find Me, my other favorite one, that wasn't an album that I loved as much as I do now when I first heard it. So to some extent, I knew that there is, a marination period with this music that, the format of this show somewhat limits. And that's not really our fault, just because I feel like expecting to review music after you've had a really long journey with it is like, it's just not feasible in critical spaces, especially not the spaces we operate within. So I had to attack this with at least some level of curiosity and not just taking everything at face value, which is really difficult because a lot of what Ryley is saying makes sense to me. But the actual conceptual bent of this album, like all of that stuff, like Matt's depression, the lack of, it doesn't really translate into anything for me on here. This is the first national album I've listened to where like it has its high points. It sure does. I'm glad this album came out for if no other reason than I have a handful of songs from the band that I really do have a lot of affinity for, and one or two I genuinely love. But this is also the first national album since the debut where I can say my prevailing criticism is that the songs aren't there. Like, I get the idea of wanting to, imbue a sense of a lack of finality, a sort of intentionally imbuing everything with a sense of disappointment. But I feel like if that's the attempt, I kind of feel like the album has stumbled in that attempt. Because to me, that doesn't really happen. What happens instead is that the National, who are a band I would think could handle that topic better than basically anybody else based off their specific proclivities and, their artistic interests. And instead, they just do nothing but tread water across this whole album. And anytime, the most frustrating thing about it is that anytime, with one exception, we get a glimpse at them doing something different, they veer right back onto the path. And look, I understand. In many respects, I think that making this album is a savvy move after I Am Easy to Find, because I Am Easy to Find, as we talked about, was an alienating album. A lot of even national fans found that to be underwhelming, messy, too long, etc., etc. The multimedia project thing maybe didn't work for some people. Maybe some people didn't engage with it at all. And I get it, just because that whole album's production is very big, very messy, and I may love it, but it happens. I get it. So wanting to steer back onto the course and maybe reassure some of the people who might have jumped off ship that we are, in fact, still the National, we are the band that you love, is smart. I agree with their decision to do this. That's, in many respects, it's like they're trying to do Trouble Will Find Me again. There are certain songs on here that I think take advantage of their fundamental strengths as a band. Eucalyptus, for instance, has this amazing guitar build and a bit of attention dispersal at the end, and the sort of repetitive song structure and denial that Matt is in lyrically here, building up as he goes along, becomes more and more potent, and he doesn't really increase the intensity of himself as a performer. He becomes more and more dejected, and that communicates the feeling of the song really well. He's basically begging this other person not to leave him over and over and over again with a really repetitive hook. But what that repetition accomplishes is something that I feel, and I get it, and I understand it. He's ascribing all of these things and almost passive-aggressively being like, take these things away because they aren't the same without you. It's a quintessential national song idea, and it would fit on tons of other records that they've made, but it still feels good. And there are other songs on here like Alien. Sonically, I'm with the really bright synths and really gargantuan distorted guitar. The sick drum fills are still here, but it somehow retains a hazy atmosphere despite the energy. And it's not lyrically limp, but its topic of trying to ground a partner that you're kind of detached to, but still somewhat connected with, feels like an old dog doing old tricks. That was a lot of what the last album was about, and it felt more potently explored on that record too. In my opinion, the best song on here is The Alcott. And the reason it's The Alcott is because Taylor Swift is here to deliver an effective counterpoint. I think that the relationship that these two display on here, that they embody, is fantastic. It's the first time on the record where it feels like they're genuinely shooting for something new and taking advantage of the strengths that they've built up on the previous album, where with all of their guest performers, they try and add a little bit of artistic alchemy to what they usually do. And that's done here, but it's in a way that does feel distinct enough. And I get it. It's got my favorite lyric on here by far, writing about someone who used to be me. That lyric is perfect, and in many respects it's perfect for this album. It's too cutting to not feel something from it, and it directly invokes the presence of someone who bears a distance from Matt in the form of Taylor's vocals. Immediately and confrontationally popping up right after that is an amazing songwriting structural choice. And it helps that they basically do everything on here that I wanted them to do. Like, this is probably a personal thing, but it frustrates me immensely that none of the other features are utilized as well as Taylor is. And it feels like it's an active attempt on their part to sort of downplay them, because they're borderline vocal features. I don't really understand the inclusion of them, but what bothers me about them is that, why do you have Phoebe Bridgers on two different songs on here to deliver vocal harmonies, one of the most potent, effective songwriters in the modern world, and you have two songs that are perfectly built to have a sort of internal dialogue exchange, and you stay the one-dimensional route and don't use her? Like, come on, you're like, this is something you did one album ago. It would make these songs genuinely so much better, and it would display a sort of multifacetedness to the songwriting here, which again retreads a lot of old ground. And I don't mean to keep making that point over and over again, but my problem is that the National keep making this point over and over again. And it's why the standout moments on here, this is why I love Taylor's features so much, is because it both really centers her as a pivotal part of this song, but it also decidedly underplays her in the sense that, like, it doesn't feel like the big Taylor Swift feature song. She is subtle on here. She is effective. She is underplayed exactly how much as she needs to be. It's a careful utilization of counterpoint that a lot of other songs would do well out of. Like the Sufjan Stevens feature on here on the opener, Once Upon a Poolside. Okay, sure, fine, whatever.
Well, the thing is, that feature is like no different to his feature on Afraid of Everyone on High Violet. It's the same thing he's doing. So it's weird to credit him as a featured artist on this when he's just doing the oohs that he did on that song.
And it really is. And it's because, like, I wouldn't have say you take featuring Sufjan Stevens off. Sure, fine, but I still feel like Sufjan Stevens' presence on this song, if accentuated or emphasized, would add something essential to this album, and it would incorporate artistic leaps that you've made on the album before this in a way that feels more accessible. And that's what I think they're trying to do with these features, is make something a bit more savvy, but still more typical. But they end up, bizarrely, not utilizing their own concepts. And throughout most of the album, I'm just kind of wondering what I get out of this experience that I don't get out of other National albums. And I know that's kind of artistically reductive, but the National have a long discography that I explored in detail last year and got to know intimately, even records I wasn't as familiar with. And now that I am familiar with them, I just don't really see a lot of what makes this album special. There's moments on here that I do feel like are kind of underrated, like Ice Machines, for example, is a song that I guess against my better judgment I find really compelling. There's a really heavy drum beat halfway through that just kind of collides with these freezing synths in the final third, and it's a really killer structural choice considering how it begins. And it's about a man who just totally doesn't know what he wants, and he's kind of listlessly wandering around. And again, that feels like it's most effectively captured on something like Ice Machines or even Tropic Morning News. And yeah, like there are moments on here too, like greasing your hair, for instance, which again, like this is a point on the album where they're meant to kind of deliver something with a bit more energy to just spice things up a bit at this point. But just lyrically and in every other way that isn't the energy of the album, it just doesn't land. I like how it conveys the minutia of a complex relationships, but it's over before it really gets a sense to, mean something to you beyond very broad strokes. And it feels like maybe it's an attempt to showcase the fleeting nature of the feelings themselves within the song, but the briefness just leads it to me not connecting with it. And I understand that may be part of the intent, but I just feel really frustrated that I only think this album is effective because it's the National making it and very little more than that.
Well, here's my interpretation of what they're trying to do here, and kind of getting to the point where I feel like I understood this as the super long-time National fan is the most satisfied I've been with the album, even if as a whole I still don't enjoy listening to it as much as I would want to. But I think fundamentally the album, as I've kind of forecast, is about being horribly depressed. It's about having this fog in front of your brain that essentially shuts everything and everyone else out from around you. It's not I don't think the songs ever really try to convey fleeting emotions as much as a lack of emotional connection to the world at all. And Greasing Your Hair is like an interesting moment as well, because it's one of my favorite songs on the record, but like fundamentally it is about that gray fog. I have no more feeling for it. I have no frame of mind. These weird dissociative images that are used in previous National records as bits of flavor text or metaphor for a particular scene or feeling that are here just kind of disconnected from any meaning and just completely, it's like someone's put Matt's brain in a tumble dryer, and these ideas that would be connected to something more tangible in previous records are just dissociated and free flowing here. And that, I guess, effectively conveys this weird writer's block situation that he's in, where he has all these tropes, the Matt Berninger tropes that he draws upon, but he's not able to do anything with them here. He's able to conjure them, but because of the state he's in, because of this horrible depression, he's not able to thread them together into anything more. And so there is a level on which I find that compelling. And if I were to describe like the I guess perspective of the album, I would say it's an album about internal dialogues, right? Because you've got that fog in front of you, or because when you're depressed and when Matt is depressed, he has this fog in front of him. He's completely shut off and isolated in his own mind, in his own brain. And that means he's really unable to effectively communicate with anyone. And this gets to where the Orcott is quite an important song and very well positioned as a centerpiece. Because anyone who's a National fan will know that for the last, basically ever since Alligator, Matt has co-written the vast majority of his lyricism with his wife, Corinne Besser. But she is a huge part of the writing process of every National song, or most National songs, certainly every National album since then, right? So you have this central dynamic in the National, which is the team, the duo. I mean, the National is a band of duos, right? You've got the brothers who are the rhythm section, you've got the brothers who do the guitars and production, and you've got this husband and wife figure who are the metamorphosized monster who present the perspectives of these albums. And so this is kind of a record about, the dynamic of Matt and Corinne has been explored on Sleep Well Beast and I'm Easy to Find. In fact, those two records, I felt like that dynamic was more the focus of what the albums were about, especially Sleep Well Beast, right? Which is this kind of marital crisis album. And this record is kind of like what happens when this symbiotic unit, these two people who are so connected and who the creativity flows through them so equally? What happens when one of them is completely frozen out from being able to cross through to the other person? What happens when they're isolated psychologically completely? And so a lot of this record is just Matt in this haze, unable to communicate with his partner or with anyone, and unable to get that symbiotic spark from that connection that helps him to be able to be creative, and just listlessly languishing in that. And, you know, I think it's not one of my favorite songs in the album, but This Isn't Helping is kind of like one of the songs that most effectively communicates this. It's just a dead song, right? There's so much about this feels like what it feels like to be depressed, just completely one note in this fucking hopeless space.
It's also the first national song since Sad Songs for Dirty Lovers that does nothing for me at all.
And that's fair, to be honest, because it's kind of a song that's about having no spark at all. And but also looking to this other person, or this idea, this image of this other person, and being totally confused by how they see the world in color when he's only able to see it in gray. I can't believe what you get away with. You find beauty in anything. Whenever you look down into a sewer, you see a diamond ring. It isn't fear how you never look like you're trying. And I find that quite emotionally compelling, but there's just the whole atmosphere of it, the musicality of it. It's just so dead, which works, but also doesn't. You know, it's that weird thing. And, you know, a lot of these songs, you kind of, I guess, address Matt's disconnection through the narrative of like breakup, you know, stories like Eucalyptus being about, you know, that situation in a long-term breakup where you have all the shit you own together and you don't know what the fuck to do with it now. What do you take? What do I take? And Matt adopting this perspective, like, no, you take all this shit because I'm not going to take all this shit, completely fobbing off any responsibility because he's unable to mentally, psychologically take that on. It's the most compelling song on the whole record to me because I deeply relate to that. And because Matt in this, he weirdly tries to turn it into something anthemic with that this isn't fair and it wouldn't be fair, and it's like you're listening to someone trying to sing an anthemic vocal line with no emotion whatsoever. It's a really weird dynamic. He's like dead inside, you can hear that, but he's trying to take the song up there, and you have the horns, you know, doing their part, and I think it kind of works. I actually am also kind of fond of New Order T-shirt, which is more restrained, but I find the acoustic guitar melody and just the atmosphere here to be very well realized. And lyrically as well, I think it is very true to some of Matt's strengths, even if he's obviously mired in the muck in terms of trying to tie them together into something more meaningful. But I think he does do it. I think he does carry on that narrative of Eucalyptus, of being kind of trapped in your memories of someone. It's kind of almost a weird sequel song to Quiet Light in a certain sense. You know, this totally being far apart from someone, having these weird images of them and not seeing any humanity in that anymore. And feeling so scared and upset by that. Tropic Morning News, the lead single, I think is one of the better songs on the record as well. I wasn't hugely into it initially as a single, but it's kind of warmed on it. It certainly has a lot of energy that the rest of the record doesn't have. But I also think that emotionally, it's also one of the more compelling and I guess immediate songs on the record, because that immediacy, emotion-wise, is just not something that Matt's really going for. But then to get to the Alcott, right? Because you're right to single this out, Jake. I think this is a really important song because you've got this whole album about it's not even miscommunication. It's no communication at all. It's complete, surrounded by clouds. And here is the moment at the center of the record where there is counterpoint. There's someone, it's like the clouds have parted for a brief moment. And Matt's able to have this back and forth, whether it's with his own brain or whether it's with some representation of his creative partner, Corinne Besser. Whatever role you think Taylor's serving here, there's loads of ways you can interpret it. It's something shifts, right? The clouds part, and you get this really, really beautiful and well-realized exploration of these different sides of Matt's brain and these different sides of Matt's situation, his predicament, you know, trying to hash out the problem. In a lot of ways, and you can see the analogs to Matt and Corinne's relationship as well, with the references to writing as well, like where Taylor sings "Read My Sentence Out Loud," and that feels very much like it's echoing their creative process, Matt and Corinne. You know, this, I'll write something, read it back to me, tell me how it feels. I need to know how it feels coming from you. And there's some lyrics that feel a little bit like they lean into some Taylorisms that I'm just not fond of in the context of the National, like that everything that's mine is a landmine, but it's fine. It's just, yeah. But the whole thing the song does, I think, works really well. In Ice Machines, you're right. Like it's nice when you have a moment you remember that Brian Devendorf is actually one of the best indie rock drummers in the game, because you don't get many of those moments on this album. And
nah.
And frankly, I think
is he even here?
It's a real no, I'm not going to say that. I was going to say it's a real Jimmy Chamberlain and Smashing Pumpkins moment, but that's too mean. It's not that bad.
It isn't, but like the fact that came to mind is not good.
It says something.
I've effectively conveyed all the things I think are compelling about this record thematically in terms of how it's being approached. And look, and I do appreciate that genuinely. It's not just me making concessions. But that said, I think the album ends with its two worst songs. I get absolutely nothing out of Your Mind Is Not Your Friend or Send For Me. These songs, not only do they feel like the National on autopilot, particularly Send For Me, they feel like they're not even emotionally communicating ideas that, well, okay, Your Mind Is Not Your Friend is not emotionally communicating anything that the record hasn't already established in its best way. And then Send For Me, which is a song that Matt wrote for his kids, right? This idea of, this reach out, I'm here song feels very sort of out of place with a lot of what else is happening on the record, and feels kind of a bit like we didn't really know how else to end this album. So
it feels very incidental.
Thematically, I like the idea of the song. I like the Matt writing a song for his kids and the core idea of a song lyrically. I think it has the potential to be quite moving. And as I'm growing distant from my kids as they grow up, but I want them to know I'm always here for them. It reminded me a little bit of Jason Isbell, Letting You Go, off of Reunions. Thematically, it has that kind of same feeling as an ending. But the song itself just doesn't get there. The weird Matt Berninger isms, the weird metaphorical images in the song, if your heart's sick in an elevator, or if you're ever on a glass top table, kind of just don't feel like they fit in the context of what the song is doing. But then everything else it's doing is just so nothing that I can't really get anything from it. And so, it is a shame to have the record end in such a way that I think it really fizzles. That's me. I do genuinely appreciate some things this record is doing, and I think some songs are great. Eucalyptus, Tropic Morning News, New Order T-shirt, and to a certain extent Grayson You Hear, love those songs. Genuinely do. And the Olcott, I think, is up there as well. Especially structurally in terms of what it does for this record. But I think it, like you said, Jake, I think you said it really well. It's an album they needed to make. They needed to clear the air. They needed to draw a line. And I hope they'll be able to really bring a little bit more inspiration and really bring a little bit more direction to what they want to do next. Because this is a directionless album. It's about being directionless, and it makes the best of that. I think it tries to, but ultimately it feels uninvolving and it feels plain. And those are things that people always say, people who don't know the National always say about them. And it's kind of gutting, frankly, to feel those when I listen to a record, to the point where I actually think this might be my least favorite National album.
So I don't know if I ever really had the opportunity to make this clear because of my infrequency on appearing on the National Retrospective, but this is my third or fourth favorite band of all time. By some distance, I think the National is like the 2010s band. And it was around the release of I Am Easy to Find and just how much that floored me that I sort of had this notion in my head that at this stage, this band literally cannot miss. Like they don't have it in them to miss, which is not fair, but they also continually defied logic for the better part of like 15 years. So I don't know how much I'm supposed to glean from the fact that they have like the most solid run in contemporary music, other than maybe they just don't know how to not be dope. And then the world ended. I think if anything was going to put a damper on the strength of a band's album run, it probably would be that. So my thoughts on this album overall are neither surprising or I don't know. I mean I guess like obviously I was excited for a new national album, but this at the same time they announced it, they also released Tropic Morning News, which is admittedly is tied for my least favorite thing here. I don't know. It just washes over me.
I think that's one of the better songs on the album, but I can't like defend that to you. I can't just be like, oh, you don't like. I'm
like I had the instinct to do the same when you all were talking about Your Mind Is Not Your Friend, because that's one of my favorites on here. But that's literally because it has a nice piano melody. That's
There was one song that I was like, oh man, I really like the piano melody on this. Or not, it wasn't even really a melody, it was just like a kind of bed of pianos that was like had the particular chord structure. And I was like, oh yeah, no, this is just like exactly the same as Think You Can Wait, which is a song that very few people have heard, but it's a really good deep cut. I can't even remember which song it is on the album that has that now. I was like, oh no, what I like about this is just that it reminds me of that song.
And yeah, that's kind of everything on here. And I don't begrudge anyone for having difficulty making an album, particularly following the run that they had, and then a global pandemic and being forced off the road for however long, and just the nature of the way things have been since we started this podcast, really. I also just I like you didn't have to make an album. This is like an album of B-sides where the A-sides never existed. And it's I don't think any of it's bad, and it has some highlights. But it's also just like I don't know if and bear with me here maybe. I think their run of albums from debatably sad songs, but definitely at least from Alligator to I Am Easy to Find is like it's like Rush's 2112 to Power Windows. And this is Hold Your Fire. And a little more and really I think a little more pointedly and closer to how I feel about this album, this is Presto.
I'm just glad it's not Roll the Bones.
Look, I mean, and look, there's a distinct possibility that like albums like Hold Your Fire, the distance we get from here, it'll probably be easier to evaluate just because, I mean, there is inevitable disappointment when you're in the moment preceding an album. So, like, I feel like Hold Your Fire's reputation in Rush really came from initial, like, synthwave bad people, and that just kind of carried until people were actually like, oh, some of this is actually pretty cool. I like new wave music.
Hold Your Fire is dope.
And it might be the case here. It's a good album, but like here,
Presto is not
feels
though.
like
I agree.
Yeah, it feels like maybe there could be a point in time where it's like, this album really is underrated, but not to the point where it's like that. Like I can't see a reappraisal happening in a significant way is what I mean.
Look, years down the line, this is always the thing when you review a new release that's not all that great from a band that is great, is that as the immediacy of it being the new thing it gives it so much like framing and weight. 10 years down the line, whether even if our opinions about the album don't change, its significance probably won't matter, won't be as big at all. Like it'll just be another national album that was one of the ones we liked less than the others,
perhaps the least.
And we can only hope that this is like, oh yeah, no, that one was a bit of a weird misfire, but they got right back on track after it. Apparently, this is also a national subreddit thing, so take it with like 500 grains of salt, but apparently they actually recorded like a lot of songs for this, and there was like weird whisperings that they might do like a companion album. I don't know, like if I would
this is a short album, so if I'm inclined to believe it at any point, it would be now.
And this is the thing as well, and I think you were kind of getting at this a little bit, Morgan, which is that when it's a great band with a hugely impressive run of records, the significance of a miss, it doesn't really matter all that much, because it's not like you've got a dearth of things to turn to. It's you've still got loads of great records, and it's a shame to muck up the run, but at the end of the day as well, it's like this is a representation of where the National are at, and we hope that the National will get to a better place, and we hope that there'll be a bit more creative inspiration with whatever happens next. And that's really all you can say. Like, you can do what I do, which is the analytical side of things as well, which I think is valid, but ultimately, at the end of the day, sometimes it doesn't work.
Frankly, it's not that surprising to me that he had some really strong writer's block with this material in particular, because it's not that intriguing. I mean, I wouldn't really know what to do with most of this either, with some exceptions, like Eucalyptus, I think, is naturally a standout. And I'm also in agreement, and don't everybody be surprised at once, but I did really like the Taylor Swift song on here. So there are obviously moments, but you could have just waited a little while longer.
I'd say the other side of that coin is that if the National had waited another full album cycle, there would have been like twice as much hype on whatever, and like intensity towards whatever was coming next. So in just gritting your teeth and making an album, there's a certain degree of like, let's just do this and clear the slate. And this all carries the implication that they think the record sucks, which I don't think they do. I'm sure they're very proud of them.
No.
But there is a certain extent with which, I think they maybe appreciate that not making music is not going to help them as a band. Ultimately, when they are able to get that creative energy happening and we're able to put something out and then tour behind it, that is the healthiest.
We'd be more enthusiastic on it overall if it didn't just kind of feel forced, and not even on Matt's part, which is the one that's admitted to it kind of feeling forced at the start. But I think on everyone's part, really, where are the Devendorfs? Have they died? Have they been replaced by animatronics? I can't hear you.
Yeah, there's
come back, Brian.
There's like teasers of interesting ideas on this. Like, one of the most disappointing songs on the record for me, which is Alien, just because it doesn't really do anything for me, I guess, whatever. But it like starts with this really neat kind of Steve Reich-esque sort of piano loping idea that I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And then that kind of just fades away. And the rest of the song has no building on that in any way. And I guess they maybe view I'm Easy to Find as their experimental album. And like, to be fair as well, when we talk about the listlessness on this album thematically and lyrically, I think you can hear that sense of kind of stuckness and stasis setting in on parts of that album. But why it works is that there's a whole conceptual bent to that record. There's a whole sense with which that energy is channeled into something bigger than that and quite emotionally powerful. Whereas it's hard to make it emotionally powerful on this record when the whole thing is just that I feel nothing. I think ultimately the reason why I'm glad they made this record is that I feel like the whole emotional deadness of this would have only festered if it hadn't been channeled into something creative. It's the kind of thing where you need to sort of exercise that part of you that's broken, that part of your process that's broken, that you need to rely on to work. You kind of need to do the artistic thing and turn your crisis into something creative, and hopefully be able through that process to move past it. I think that's probably what Matt was doing with a lot of this, was trying to just take your stasis, take your stuckness, make a whole record about that, forget about how quality wise what it is, do that artistic part of the process and hopefully exercise it. And so, yeah, I think that's probably what this is to some extent. And I'm glad it exists. Like, even as a disappointing National record, I don't wish they hadn't put it out. I'm glad they put it out. And like I said, some great songs on it. It's just hard to bring that energy to our discussion of it that we would want to bring, given how much those other records animate us. I think that's the biggest disappointment, is that there isn't more for us to get jazzed about or vocal about or energetic about in any direction. It's just really hard for us to approach that level the way we do with every other national album. And that's the thing that's most disappointing about it, I think. What I will say is, if they're coming to your city or near your city, go and see them live, because I have no doubt that the songs will probably sound amazing in that context, because the National are just built for that.
Probably.
You know, like I've seen
Nice if they came within like 500 miles of us.
Yeah, well,
preaching to. Well, you've seen them, so I don't want to hear it.
We border Ohio, Matt. Come on.
Yeah, that's actually some bullshit that they haven't come. That's like, you know, remember your roots. You know,
You've forgotten your Midwestern ways.
You've
forgotten the face of your father, Matt Berninger.
What are you, to New York for Ohio now? You fucking cowboys.
You above some fucking Kentucky gentlemen?
Well, you get a little bit of that.
You prick.
You get a little bit of that produced by Aaron Dessner, Taylor Swift, and now all of a sudden, you know,
a little bit of that Ed Sheeran money. What's going on? Fucking sellouts.
Alrighty, let's do our favorite tracks and ratings then for the Nationals' first 2 pages of Frankenstein. Shout out Mel Brooks.
The boy.
All right, I'll go first this time. My 3 favorites are Eucalyptus, New Order T-shirt, and Tropic Morning News. My least favorite is probably Alien. Either that or Send For Me. I mean, yeah. And I'm going to give the album a 5 out of 10.
My 3 favorites are the thing that koalas wipe their butts with, the Alcott, and Your Mind Is Not Your Friend, featuring Phoebe Bridgers.
I mean, she's discernible, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, why didn't you credit Lisa Hannigan for So Far So Fast, guys? And then you credit Phoebe Bridgers for.
Can we also just but just like acknowledge briefly how, like, I know this was something I said as soon as the track list was announced, how fucking like national song generator these titles are. Not even that, but also kind of like parody of national song titles, like New Order T-shirt, This Isn't Helping, Grease in Your Here, Your Mind Is Not Your Friend. Like, these are like joke titles that someone would make up to like poke fun at the National.
It's because he forgot how to write. Yeah, least favorite.
You just ethered a depressed man.
I am the depressed man. 5.5.
Honestly, the only song on here I truly love is the Alcott. But I do like Eucalyptus a lot, and I do like, yeah, sure, why not? Ice Machines, underrated track. Nobody likes that one. Least favorite, This Isn't Helping. I mean, like, God, has a song title ever been more apt? It's like, this isn't helping the pacing of your fucking record. I've probably come across a lot more negative on this than I actually feel. That's just because all the interesting things about this album are the bad things. It's, you know, it's still a national album. It's still thoughtfully made, but like 6, I like it more than the self-titled.
All right, that gives us an average overall of 5.5 for the Nationals' first 2 pages of Frankenstein. Let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've reviewed today. Jessie Ware's That Feels Good, or the Nationals' first 2 pages of Frankenstein. Obviously, 2 very different tones in our discussions here, so I want to hear some alternate perspectives out there as well. Have you been enjoying the National album more than we have? What are your feelings on the Jessie Ware record? Want to hear some different perspectives, want to hear some different thoughts, or if you agree with us as well, feel free to stroke our egos. That always goes down well. Whatever you think, let us know in the comments below, because we love seeing what you have to say, and it's honestly what makes this all worth it, frankly. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing as well. If you haven't already done those things, they both help us out a lot. If you are one of the new subscribers, we've had a big influx recently, so hello to you if you are one of those. And if you're an OG that's been around for a while, big hello to you too. If you want to go above and beyond and support the channel directly, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month and become a member of the Jams T family. Get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about and in now episodes, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Coca-Cola, open happiness.